everybody. During the past few months of lockdown on a Wednesday evening as a church, we've been looking at this series called A House Connected to Heaven. And the reason that we've been doing this series is because, as you know, we've not all been able to come together in our church building during the past few months. Consequently, it's really important that when we're in our houses, that we are spending time seeking God and drawing closer to Him. If you've been following this series on a Wednesday evening, you'll remember that we looked at people like Cornelius, who encountered God in his house and whose house was connected to heaven. You'll also remember that we looked at Obed-Edom. In Chronicles, Obed-Edom had the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark of God's presence, brought into his house. His house was connected to heaven. You'll remember also that we looked at the widow who saw the supernatural flow of oil in her house when she shut the door. We also looked at the well-to-do woman whose house was connected to heaven. She prepared a room for the prophet Elisha and she saw her son brought back to life. We also saw the widow of Zarephath who saw the supernatural provision of God with the little flour and the little oil that she had, and she also saw her son raised back from the dead in her house. We also saw Job, and in Job chapter 1 we saw how Job's house was connected to heaven. And not only that, we also saw in the New Testament in Acts chapter 12 Mary, the mother of John Mark, whose house was connected to heaven. The believers would come together there and pray for Peter when he was in prison. We've also seen examples of people who didn't have a house connected to heaven. If you remember, we looked at King David, who instead of going off to battle stayed at home, and it was when he was at home that he wasn't seeking God, but rather he fell into laziness and then to sin, and he lost the presence of God. And we also saw in Judges chapter 17 the example of Micah, who wanted to have a house connected to heaven, but who went about it the wrong way and who had bad relationships in his home. He also had sin, and he had idolatry and religion in his house. And today we are going to look at the story of Abraham as we continue this series called A House Connected to Heaven. Now, I would like to say from the start that Abraham, of course, lived in a tent. He didn't live in a house, but you understand the principle that I'm sharing this evening. I'm going to read from Genesis chapter 18. It says, "The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground. He said, 'If I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under this tree. Let me get you something to eat so that you can be refreshed and then go on your way, now that you have come to your servant.' 'Very well,' they answered, 'do as you say.' So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah. 'Quick,' he said, 'get 3 seahs of fine flour and knead it and bake some bread.' Then he ran to the herd and selected a choice tender calf and gave it to a servant who hurried to prepare it. He then brought some curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared and set these before them. While they ate, he stood near them under a tree. 'Where is your wife Sarah?' they asked him. 'There in the tent,' he said. Then the Lord said, 'I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife will have a son.' Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already old and well advanced in years, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, 'After I am worn out and my master is old, will I now have this pleasure?' Then the Lord said to Abraham, 'Why did Sarah laugh and say, "Will I really have a child now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son.' Sarah was afraid, so she lied and said, 'I did not laugh.' But he said, 'Yes, you did laugh.'" Well, this evening we're going to be looking at this passage in Genesis chapter 18 as we continue the series, A House Connected to Heaven. And we're looking at the example of Abraham. Please stay with us and thank you for joining us. When we read Genesis chapter 18, and when we see these three men who came to visit Abraham, it's important to ask ourselves the question, who were these men who came to visit Abraham? Because I don't believe they were just normal men, so to speak. When we read Genesis chapter 19, I believe that we see that two of these three men were actually angels who came to visit Abraham when he was at home. And also, the third person, I believe, was the Lord. You can read that in Genesis chapter 18, verse 13. It says, "Then the Lord said to Abraham." So I want you to imagine that. Jesus coming to your house with two angels. Wow. How would you feel if Jesus knocked on your door with two angels? What would you do? Would you run to the shop? Would you take him to a restaurant? Would you freeze? How would you react? Just imagine how Abraham must have felt with the Lord actually coming to his tent with two angels. It must have been absolutely incredible. But this is a continuation of our series, A House Connected to Heaven. A house connected to heaven. Jesus coming with two angels to Abraham's tent, or Abraham's house, so to speak. Now, there are three things that Abraham does when Jesus and the angels visit him. I want first of all just to say that Abraham bowed down before the Lord. You know, it's really so important that when we're in our houses that we are spending time worshipping the Lord, either as individuals or as couples or as families. How sad would it be if we're only Sunday Christians who only sing the Lord's praises or worship the Lord when we're all together in the church building on a Sunday morning? You know, it's so important that when we're in our houses, we're meeting with Jesus and we're bowing down before him and we're worshipping him. And that's what Abraham did when the Lord came to his house. He bowed down. The second thing that Abraham did, which is really important for us to do if we are to have houses connected to heaven, I believe, is that it's important that we are generous towards God. What did Abraham do when the Lord came to his house? He had the fattened calf, the best food prepared for the Lord. Abraham didn't give the Lord leftovers. On the contrary, he had the best animal slaughtered. You know, that's a picture of us, that when we give to the Lord, it's important that we give of our best, that we give of the first fruits, that we don't give the leftovers to the Lord. I'm sure that if Jesus was to come to our house, we would want to give him the very best meal that we could give him. And therefore, it's so important, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, that we are giving to the Lord the best of what he has given us, and not just the leftovers, or giving nothing at all. And the third thing that Abraham does for the Lord, and I believe this is so important if we are to have houses connected to heaven, is that Abraham served. You know, when I read this passage, I was quite surprised. I thought, culturally speaking, Abraham wouldn't have done the serving. But the amazing thing is, when Jesus and when the angels came to Abraham's tent, when they came to visit Abraham in his house, they said it was Abraham who actually served them. You know, if we are to have houses connected to heaven, it's important that we're worshipping in our houses. It's important as well that we are giving to the Lord that which he has given us, giving back to him. But also, it's important that we always have a heart to serve the Lord. You know, we don't want to be just Sunday Christians. We don't want to be people who are just religious. But it's so important that day after day, in everything that we can do, we are doing it to serve the Lord and to minister to him and to bless him. And I can just imagine Abraham taking so much delight in serving the Lord when he came to his house. If you're at a stage in your life when you feel that your house isn't connected to heaven, when you feel that maybe you've lost the presence of God during this time of lockdown, I would encourage you to come back to Genesis chapter 18 and to remember these three things and to make these three things a priority in your life. I believe that there are really fundamental principles for a Christian. Number one, Abraham in his house worshipped the Lord when the Lord came. He bowed down. Second of all, Abraham gave to the Lord. It's so important that we're not giving the Lord the leftovers, but Abraham gave the best that he had for the Lord to eat. And thirdly, what did Abraham do? Abraham served the Lord. Let's never forget these principles, the principle of worshipping, the principle of giving, and the principle of serving. And I believe that as we do these things during lockdown, we will see our lives connected to heaven and we will meet God in our homes, and that ultimately the Lord will want to come and draw close to us. Now, we don't obviously do these things as works to try and gain God's favour. We do it because we want to be in a relationship with Jesus and we want to bless his heart in the same way that Abraham did. And there's just one other thought that I would like to leave you from Genesis chapter 18, and it's this. When the Lord came to visit Abraham in his house, or in his tent more specifically, the Lord came to remind Abraham of a promise that he had already been given. You see, during this time of lockdown, I don't know if you're feeling discouraged, if you're feeling a bit weary, but I would encourage you to come back to the promises that God has spoken to your life. I would encourage you to come back to the prophetic words that God has spoken over your life. I would encourage you, even this evening, to read them or to listen to them, to meditate on them, to reflect them, and to pray them back to God. Because maybe God, during this time of lockdown, when you're in your house, would like to remind you of the wonderful promises that he's spoken to you in the same way that he did when he came to visit Abraham in his house or in his tent. God bless you. I hope the message has been clear this evening. Let's continue to encounter God in our houses during lockdown when we can't all be in the church building together. I encourage you to read Genesis chapter 18 and also to remember the promises of God that have been spoken over your life. God bless you. Have a great evening. Bye.